What is going on, guys? I am Paul Ryan, your host of the Not ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is my co-host, the best co-host in the world, Dave PigskinPapers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
Paul, I'm doing well, and I'm wondering if we're ever going to rename this show, if we're just going to keep calling it the Not ATB Fantasy Show, which people must hear that and wonder, okay, why are you the Not ATB Fantasy Show? But putting the show name aside, I'm doing pretty well tonight. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, I can't complain. It's over 100 degrees here in Texas, but outside of that, it's been a good day.
All right. I'm in Vermont right now. It's about 60 degrees outside.
Oh, no one wants to hear that. Oh, my God.
And raining. Don't get too excited. So it's a very different weather.
Dave, where can we find you on Twitter, a.k.a. X?
Yes, on Twitter, a.k.a. X, I am at PigskinPapers. All of my content starting about 2 months ago, so for this entire football season, is at Big Blue View, which is the Giants page on the SB Nation family of sports fandom sites. I'm on the Giants page, but I'm mostly writing league-wide fantasy football stuff. And I actually posted my latest article went up today. It's players I'm targeting at ADP, and I'll have another column out in a couple days, which is I call the one that went today green light, players I'm targeting, and the one that's coming up in a couple days is red light, which is players I'm avoiding at ADP. So I got a lot of preseason content up. I'm excited to be over there at SB Nation. It's been a good move for me. Paul, where can people find you on X, and where can they get at your content?
Yes, you can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15, and that's where you can find all of my content. My Cowboys themed podcast can be found there on X and on YouTube. And of course, this show can be found on both X and YouTube as well. Well, tonight, Dave and I will be continuing our series, Divisions of Fantasy, and we'll be joined by our last guest nominee, Drew 3MR. Joining us tonight is fantasy analyst for Last Word on Sports. You can find him every Wednesday on Fourth and Frames. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rhett Mitchell to the show. Rhett, how are you?
Dude, I'm just so happy to be here. Happy to be hanging out with you guys tonight. Just, as always, take a little bit of time to talk ball on a Sunday night. Never a bad thing. Just looking to have some fun. Just hang out with you guys.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Rhett, where can we find you on X, a.k.a. Twitter?
All right, I can be found at Manual Sports on X. Probably not as active as I should be, but I got a lot of tires and a lot of fires right now. Whether I'm doing stuff, I happen to also do local stuff for my for newspapers around Louisiana, doing high school sports. Also a full-time teacher, also a full-time husband and a parent of two. So I'm just I'm busy, but always fun to take an hour out for you guys. So no problem.
Well, Rhett, we really appreciate you being here with us tonight. It's hard to believe 3 Sundays from right now, we'll be watching the Sunday night game of the first NFL weekend, and either very happy immediately with our fantasy teams or wondering, do we make some mistakes? But the summer has kind of flown by, and redraft season or draft season for redraft leagues and fantasy has officially started. There's a lot of people are going to be drafting over the next, I would say, 2 weeks. So I think it's a great time of year for football fans and fantasy players. And hopefully tonight we'll hit on some players and teams that'll be of interest to people, and cover some players that people might be thinking of drafting or wanting to hear more opinions on before they draft them. So last week, as Paul mentioned, we're doing our divisions of fantasy. So we're going through the different divisions in the NFL and trying to analyze them from a fantasy perspective. And last week we had the NFC West, and that's kind of a gold mine. No pun for the 49ers, but a gold mine for fantasy, because you've really got 4 teams that all have a lot of nice fantasy assets. And this week we're going to be talking about a division that has been kind of the laughing stock of the NFL the last couple of years. Like most of the last 2 years, there hasn't been a team over 500 in this division. 9-8's been good enough to win it for the Bucs the last 2 years. But there are some players that are pieces that we want in fantasy. It just might be lacking some of the bigger difference-making star power that helps you win fantasy week. So I'm excited to talk about this division because I think there are some interesting players to talk about.
And look, this is one of those situations where I really like talking about divisions like this because everybody knows you go to the Rams and you know what you're going to get there. It's Puka, it's Kyron Williams, it's those sort of guys. I like discussing these teams where in the NFC South, you kind of have to dig a little bit deeper, work a little bit harder to find that gravy and things like that. So, this is a fun one to talk about, despite the fact that it might not be the most, sexy division you're going to have in fantasy football this season.
Right. So people stay tuned. This is worth time.
Yeah, this is an interesting division for sure. It's a little top heavy with secondary pieces that we like in Dynasty and Best Ball. But in redraft, some of these guys are probably a year away from really offering very much value. The NFC South was once a division that had multiple fantasy studs on every team, but is going through a transition rebuild phase, if you will. Rhett, I know you're a Saints fan, so I'll save the best for last tonight. One team in the NFC South has a lot of people excited this season, that team being the Atlanta Falcons. Kirk Cousins is easily the best quarterback Atlanta has had since Matt Ryan. At his age and coming off a major injury, if you roster Cousins in Dynasty Superflex leagues, should you handcuff him with Michael Penix Jr.?
Dude, in my opinion, when you're looking at handcuffs, even in Dynasty, I'm always the type of guy that's just trying to maximize my spread on a team, right? So to me, it doesn't make much sense, even if you have unless you have a really injury-prone starter and a good handcuff at a running back, like you might have with Atlanta, Bijan and Algier kind of makes sense. But it especially doesn't make sense for me at the quarterback position. I mean, why would you occupy a second roster spot when in most cases you have, 20, 21 roster spots? Why would you take two of your roster spots up with quarterbacks from one team when you could just as easily get Kirk Cousins and then go somewhere else later on, maybe even another late-round quarterback, maybe one that's in this division a little bit later that I kind of like. But, there's a way you can do this because Kirk Cousins is definitely at his best, he's going to be a low-end quarterback one. So, and in most cases, he's probably being drafted about a mid-tier quarterback too. So, you're going to get a lot of good weeks out of him. But no, I'm just not completely into the idea of drafting Michael Penix just because Kirk Cousins had an injury last year. If you need a second quarterback, go get one from another team that you know is going to be starting and have some extra value on your rosters. Don't just clutter them up just because.
Yeah, I have a feeling Penix is going to end up being one of those guys that won't get drafted in certainly in redraft leagues. Super flex leagues, maybe, when people start taking third quarterbacks, if it's a deep bench. One QB leagues, I don't see it. But if anything happens to Cousins, you will see people get interested in him on the waiver wire. And, I think that's where he'll sit for most of the season. And, he may not play this year. Well, he may not start a game this year. It just depends on Cousins' health. And we don't have to get into, why the Falcons did what they did. I mean, it's still kind of a head scratcher that they took him with the 8th pick. But, another guy they took with the 8th pick, so I'll segue to this, is Bijan Robinson, or at least I think it was the 8th pick. It was something close to it 2 years ago. And everyone's really excited to see what Bijan will do now that Arthur Smith and his maddening use of running backs is out of the picture. But reports are coming in that, Tyler Algier is a good back, and some reports are coming in that they still plan to split the workload to some degree. Rhett, do you have any concern that Bijan won't get the workload? His ADP is top 5. He's a, top end of the first round player. And in some cases, he's the number 1 running back on people's boards, even ahead of McCaffrey. Any concern that he won't get the workload he needs to be a top 2 or 3 running back in fantasy, or even a top 5 running back?
I guess my first question I have to ask you for that is, what is the touch threshold that you would think he'd need to have? Is 250 too low? Is 275 too low? Or does he absolutely need to hit 300, in your opinion, for it to be worth it? Let's start with that, and then I can give you a better answer.
I mean, 20 touches a game ends up being 340 touches, so that's a lot. I would say maybe 275 to 300, kind of in that range, is what I would consider a pretty heavy workload. And for a back with his explosiveness, if you're talking about like Devon Achane, for example, he doesn't need 300 touches to be an RB1, right? Or even 275 necessarily. And Bijan might not either. We just didn't see, he didn't get enough workload last year. And the quarterback, they had so many turnovers in the red zone last year. Like, they were like a turnover machine in the red zone. So he probably lost some touchdowns that he would have likely gotten, if they were a little more of an efficient team. So the long answer to your question is I would say like 250 to 275 is enough workload.
Well, I'm looking at his stats from last year. He had 214 carries last year and another 58 receptions last year. So he was in that 270 range in year one last year. So if you're asking me whether Tyler Algier is going to get more work or he eats into that workload even more this season, absolutely not. I mean, for me, I'm looking at Bijan Robinson and I'm saying, okay, we're probably in that 220 carry range again. He was at 4.6 a carry last year. Maybe that bumps up to about 4.8, 4.9. So now we're looking at 1,000-yard back with room to spare. Looking at his touchdown numbers from last year, he had 8 total, only 4 at the ground. For some reason, they love Tyler Algier around the goal line. I'm expecting Bijan to get a little more goal line work this year. So that plus the fact that I don't think we quite hit his receiving upside yet, I think he could be a 70 to 75 catch back in the right situation. And Kirk Cousins being a guy who does not run seems to be the right situation. So to return that value, what you're talking about, top 3 running back, we could see him get 300 touches this year if he hits that reception threshold that he can. And if he does, I mean, God bless the owners of him because he might be our 101 next year if he does that this season. Yeah,
and by the way, don't forget last year they gave Jonnu Smith 2 red zone carries on that team. I mean, Arthur Smith was just doing things that were making fantasy managers scratch their heads. So.
Yeah, shout out to Arthur Smith. Yes, kind of sticking here with Atlanta, Rhett. Atlanta has 2 somewhat polarizing players on offense that fantasy players have been patiently waiting to break out, and Drake London and Kyle Pitts. Of the 2, who do you prefer in redraft?
I prefer Drake, and that's at a cost situation right now. He's going wide receiver 12, and Pitts is tight end 7. I just think that Drake is just one of these guys that we've kind of just been waiting once again, like it seems like with everybody in this offense, for the right guy to be running this offense, right? For the right coach to come into the situation. Having a Rams light system, Zach Robinson being the offensive coordinator, we know what that's going to be. There's going to be, in all likelihood, a bell cow back. There is going to be a consolidated target share. And the tight end is going to get a fair amount of use too. So there's a very good possibility that all 3 of these dudes are going to have fantastic fantasy seasons. But as of right now, just at cost, I think Drake is probably who I prefer just slightly right now. But I don't want Drew to get mad at me. I know he's watching right now. I'm still very high on Kyle Pitts. That is his dude. So, yeah, they pick your poison, in my opinion. It's pretty much neck and neck.
Yeah.
Well, I put Pitts in my players to target column this year, and I swore I would never do that again after 2 years ago. So we'll see on Kyle Pitts. But the Falcons have almost been like running themselves like a fantasy team. The last 4 years, they've had 4 top 10 picks, and they've taken a quarterback, a running back, a wide receiver, and a tight end. So if you look at them now. And you compare their kind of skill players to the rest of the other teams in the NFC South, I guess 2 questions for you, Rhett. One, do they kind of dwarf the rest of the teams in the division just from a fantasy standpoint in terms of the assets they have? And are we all too high on the Falcons? This is a team that hasn't won the division since whatever that year was that they went to the Super Bowl, I think. And they got a 36-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles tear. Do they have the best do they have the best group in the division of fantasy assets, but are we too high on them?
Yes, I do think they have the best group of fantasy assets in the division, but I'm going to say this. Anytime you have a team that has all these sort of assets in the same team, there is no possible way they can all return at the value in which they're being drafted. Houston is another one of those teams this year. I know we're not in that division, but I mean, you cannot convince me for the life of me that Tank Dell, Nico Collins, and Stephon Diggs are all going to return top 36 wide receiver value, with Joe Mixon being a running back one or borderline running back one, and Dalton Schultz being the top 12 tight end. It's just not happening. So with Atlanta, things are a little more consolidated. There is a very good chance that Bijan's a high-end running back one. Let's just kind of pencil that in because I feel good about that. And one of Drake and Pitts are going to outperform where they're currently being drafted this year. I don't think it's going to be both of them, but I think one of them is going to outperform because somebody has to be the top pass catcher in that offense. And I think both are equally talented, but if they're both playing outside and they're both playing receiver, it's going to be a little bit harder to decide who that's going to be. But Cousins has done a good job over the years of making tight ends a lot better, like TJ Hawkinson's best years, Kyle Rudolph's best years. All these tight ends that have pretty much have had their best years have done it with Kirk Cousins. So, I mean, don't doubt the man. Achilles or not, he ain't got to run much. He just got to get the ball out quickly. So,
yeah, I like that assessment there. Atlanta is an interesting team for sure. You bring up a good point about them probably not all being able to return value as far as ADP goes. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. I hadn't actually looked at that situation that way. But let's move on here to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, another team, an interesting team here. And Mike Evans, another older receiver, but who has been consistent with 10 consecutive years of 1,000 or more receiving yards and 4 wide receiver one seasons in his last 6 years, in addition to 3 double-digit TD seasons in his last 4 years. Yet he goes off the board as the wide receiver 32 in Dynasty startups. Is Evans a player you're buying in Dynasty?
Wide receiver 32 in Dynasty at his age. I'm probably not drafting him. If I'm in an existing Dynasty and I'm in a championship window, then I'm 100% acquiring him.
Yeah.
And the main reason behind that is as a Dynasty player, we kind of all want to be ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve. Mike Evans has done a tremendous job of being a 1,000-yard, 8-touchdown guy over the years. And he may be that again this year. But the point is, right now, he's right along that line where you're going to start to see diminishing returns. Could be this year, could be next year, could be that third year. But I, in a Dynasty situation, am trying to maximize value for championship windows. So Evans in the short term, great short-term buy. If you're relying on him at a startup, and you're looking for a 3-4 year window, I'm not sure I'm into that.
Fair. Yeah, that makes sense. Last year, Evans was just in redraft leagues, was just such a tremendous smash. I don't know if he has that in him again, but we'll move on to their backfield. And Rachaad White was really a pleasant surprise last year, and a great value to the fantasy managers who took him in whatever his ADP was last year, probably around the 6th, 7th round. And he was one of the few workhorse backs in 2023. Tampa has hinted that they want to reduce his workload, and they recently drafted a dynamic running mate for him in Bucky Irving. Another thing about White, he's played 2 seasons in the NFL, and he has not been an efficient running back. He averaged 3.7 yards per carry as a rookie, 3.6 yards last year. But he just kept getting the ball, both handoffs and being peppered with targets. But when you consider the addition of Irving and that almost half of White's fantasy production last year came via passing, is he someone you'd feel comfortable with as your RB1 in any format? And do you like him at his current ADP, which I think is maybe like late 3rd, early 4th, or maybe he's into the 4th round? I haven't looked recently.
Okay, at ADP, I think I'm fine with him where he is. As for whether I'm going to rely on him to be my first running back, I don't think so. So if we have, let's run through a quick hypothetical draft. The first round, you are late first, you take an AJ Brown. The second round, you take another receiver. The third round, you go tight end and you take somebody like a Laporta, Kelsey, whoever that is. By round 4, if you need that running back and you're already pretty set at wide receiver, if you know you're getting bankable, guaranteed weekly points somewhere, I'm sure take a flyer on Rachaad White. But on the other hand, I think I feel even better if you're drafting early in a draft and you can get a Bijan or a Christian McCaffrey, and then Rachaad White is your running back 2 at that point. Then it's wheels up, and that's a build I'm really into. But at the same time, I haven't seen any Tampa preseason games so far. I'm not sure how Bucky Irving has looked. But at the same time, with a guy like Bucky Irving, you either have to be really good at something that you do, or you have to be really, really extremely off the charts athletic like A-Chain was last year. And his value is in being a pass catcher. But at the end of the day, Rachaad White's probably still a 2-down back who's getting some running back, who's getting some pass work in there as well. Depending on where you're getting Bucky Irving, and if I could look that up real quick, he is going to be running back much lower. So he's probably in the 50s at this point. Yeah, he's running back 58 on the Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings. So he is seen as a low-end running back 5. You want to take Rachaad White and take the Bucky Irving handcuff? I'm really into that idea as well. But anything higher than that, I mean, it's an interesting thing. But Rachaad White, unless we see a really marked improvement in his rushing efficiency this year, I mean, if Bucky Irving really starts to take some of that pass work, this might be the last true year of Rachaad White relevance, and that scares me.
Yeah, I see that. Bucky Irving, for what it's worth, has actually looked pretty good in preseason. He's looked as advertised, so something to keep an eye on for sure. I like the idea of handcuffing Rachaad White with him, and just in case, and even in best ball, I feel like that's a fun backfield to do that with.
Yeah, I think if you, especially with a guy like Bucky Irving, best ball and really any fantasy format in general, I really enjoy filling out redraft and dynasty rosters with spike week guys you can plug in on bye weeks. Like, it's just something that can just give you weeks, can win you weeks. I mean, you plug in the right guy the right week. I mean, all of a sudden you pop in Bucky Irving in a flex spot and he gives you a 19-point week because he catches 6 balls for 53 yards and snakes a touchdown. All of a sudden, like, that's a valuable thing. He's already return value considering he's a running back 5 in redraft right now. So, I mean, it's just anytime these guys just give you any kind of week that with those late round dart throws, I mean, they're returning value pretty easily. So, yeah, why not? Take a shot on them.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know, another guy people took a shot on last year was Baker Mayfield, who had a career resurgence, but most people think that was because of Dave Canales. Canales is now in Carolina, and Baker signed a new deal with Tampa. When you consider the weapons Tampa has and what he showed last year, finishing as a QB10, is Baker someone you would target as your QB1 in Superflex leagues?
That depends on my build. Right now in Superflex, he's a strong quarterback 2, undoubtedly. But think of what it means to be a quarterback 1 in a Superflex format. A quarterback 1 in a Superflex format is being taken in the top 2 or 3 rounds of these drafts. Just from a strictly ADP standpoint. And y'all can answer me and y'all can shoot me down. I'm more than comfortable with myself. But are we comfortable taking Baker Mayfield in the top 2 or 3 rounds of any fantasy draft, even if it's a Superflex? And if your answer is no, then he's not a quarterback 1 for you in Superflex. And that's where we are at the end of the day. Now, if you're hitting us with a hero build and you're loading everything up and it's round 5, 6, 7, and then you're taking a quarterback and maybe you get a Mike Evans and a Chris Godwin inside of your build and you're kind of sneaking those stack points right there, then yeah, take a shot on Baker. But I happen to be in the number that thinks it might have been a Canales thing, but also 2 years ago, he kind of started to resurge himself with those last few starts with the Rams at the end of the season. So, I mean, this is the year where we really find out what Baker is, because he doesn't have Canales. He doesn't have Sean McVay. It's just a matter of is Liam Cohen going to be a guy that continues to get the best out of him? And if so, then you're going to get value on Baker Mayfield, because like we said, I'm not taking him in the top 3 rounds of a super flex draft, but if you can get him round 6, round 7, round 8, then yeah, it's good value potentially.
You know, it's kind of funny that Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold were both drafted in 2018. And here we are in 2024, and it's kind of like, let's see if they can do it. You know, like they're both on like their 4th team or whatever it is, getting a chance to start. And Baker obviously, you know, is with the same team that he had a good year with last year. So it sort of seems like maybe he's found himself and found his career. Darnold, we'll see. But it's just kind of funny because like the other QBs in that draft in that first round who made it are Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. You know, we had no questions about those two.
Yeah, and that was one of those drafts where we all kind of questioned Buffalo for taking Josh Allen as high as they did. Like, because it was strictly a toolsy pick, right? You're like, oh, he throws the ball far and he's big and big man run fast. And we're like, okay, yeah, okay, I see the toolsy pick, but how often have we seen toolsy picks really work out? I mean, raise your hand if you watch Blake Bortles in Jacksonville.
Yeah.
That they don't always work out that way, no matter how much physical talent the guy has. Allen just happened to be in the right situation, get a Stephon Diggs, and actually start to develop, and Buffalo saw something in there, and credit to him on that.
Yeah, and credit Brian Daboll too.
Yeah.
Because I think he really, you know, Josh Allen's first year or two were kind of rough, but he kept improving, and then he just broke out in 2020. But getting back to the Bucs, and you mentioned Evans and Godwin. You know, I don't think there's a 1-2 receiver duo in the NFL that's been together as long as those two have. I think Godwin came into the league in 2017, and by like 2018 or 2019, he was the clear wide receiver 2 there behind Mike Evans or with Mike Evans. They also have other receivers on the roster, obviously. But where would you rank Tampa's receivers among other teams in the NFL? I mean, do you think they have like one of the top 5 or 6 duos or tandems, or are they further down for you?
It's probably close to being a borderline top 10 unit. I mean, Evans and Godwin, fantastic. Behind them, Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer, a little more unproven in that situation. But both guys who, in the right situation, if Godwin or Evans goes down, these are both guys that you could see stepping up and, you know, having a couple decent weeks and returning some fantasy value off the waiver wire. I think McMillan might even get drafted late in a couple places this year, depending on how deep the league is. So I think it's a top 10 unit. I know they're high on McMillan in camp. They've said some good things about him. I think he's going to have that third wide receiver slot sewn up. Trey Palmer was a guy who, heading out of last season, I thought was going to have more of a role this season. Maybe they saw something over the offseason that I didn't. I mean, I'm not in the building with them. But, yeah, they're an interesting unit, probably borderline top 10, maybe even 10th, 11th, 12th, something along those lines. So real solid unit for sure.
You know, maybe the worst team in this division is the Carolina Panthers. Let's talk about them. And with Jonathan, or excuse me, you know, Tampa Bay has one of the better groups of receivers. Unfortunately, Carolina can't say the same. Outside of Deontay Johnson, is there another Panthers receiver you think has fantasy appeal?
That depends on Xavier Legette's ADP. Because he is a guy that the obvious comparison, South Carolina guy, big, physical, fast. I mean, there's an obvious Deebo Samuel comparison there, right? And if they use him in that sort of situation where they're getting the ball out to him quickly and, you know, he's getting some yak and doing things like that, I mean, there can be some weeks there. But he still has Adam Thielen to kind of compete with to get those sort of, you know, quick touches out. So, I mean, I think I've given up on Jonathan Mingo. I think Deontay Johnson is probably a 140, 150 target guy this season. And anytime you have a guy getting that many targets, that's a guy I want, especially where he's going in drafts right now. But for the most part, I think I'm probably staying away from most of that receiver room. And Leggette's getting drafted, so I'm probably not having a shot at him on the waiver wire. So at this point, I think it's Deontay and not much else that I would really concern myself with.
Rhett, I appreciate you continuing to mention guys that were in my guys I'm targeting article. Because I mentioned Deontay Johnson. I mean, he may not score a lot of touchdowns, but I agree with you. I think, what they need for Bryce Young is quick, easy, open receivers, near the line of scrimmage, get the ball out quick. And Deontay Johnson, one thing he's always been able to do is get open, and not just in the short area. He's able to get open all over the field and command a lot of targets. And I think that he'll quickly be Bryce Young's best friend. And I'm not high on him to be like a wide receiver 1 this year or anything like that. I just think he's going to – I agree with you. I think he's going to get, if he stays healthy, 150 targets, which should translate to over 100 catches. And maybe not a lot of touchdowns, like I said. Moving to their backfield. So, they took Jonathan Brooks. He's recovering from a torn ACL. It kind of sounds like – I don't know if he'll start the season on PUP, but it sounds like he won't be ready week 1. And they have no reason to rush him back. I mean, they're not likely to be competing for a playoff spot this year, and they're trying to develop their young talent. And they'll probably bring him along a little bit slowly. Who do you think is the better bet at ADP this season in redraft leagues? Jonathan Brooks or a few rounds later, Chuba Hubbard?
This is a complicated answer because Jonathan Brooks is a guy, one of the 2 guys in this rookie class, he and Trey Benson, that I think are going to have long-term fantasy value. I think Marshawn Lloyd is an interesting guy, but I just don't see him being a long-term 4, 5, 6-year producer at the fantasy in fantasy football. So I really like Jonathan Brooks. But then I also just looked up these stats because I'm more than anything, I love looking at guys and seeing how efficient they are. And if I can't be in on Rachaad White at 300 touches, being an inefficient rusher, although he is going much higher, Chuba Hubbard at 277 touches last year with 39 receptions and 3.9 yards per carry with that sort of speed, that did concern me last year. That being said, they really did a lot of work to improve that offensive line this offseason. I mean, you had guys like Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt on the interior offensive line. I mean, they've gotten a lot better, and this is the year we're going to see it with Chuba Hubbard. He's going to have a good offensive line in front of him. He should be able to use that speed and go from a 3.9 carry guy to something more of the lines that we saw in 2022 with 95 carries. He had 4.9 yards per carry. So I'm not saying he's a 5-yard per carry guy this year, but if Chuba's around 4.4, 4.5, and Carolina is competitive, I don't think there is a reason why they need to rush back Jonathan Brooks. I think you can bring him along more slowly. I think you can kind of make it more of a 50-50 situation. And then in 2025, there's probably more of a chance that Jonathan Brooks becomes a guy that people are drafting more willingly in redraft formats. But in Dynasty, of course, for me right now, he's a hold. So the short version of this is Chuba Hubbard short term, Jonathan Brooks long term. Maybe Jonathan Brooks takes a job late in the season.
Got it. As a Dolphin fan, let me just ask, because you mentioned the rookie running backs that you thought had sort of like long-term fantasy value, and you didn't mention Jalen Wright, who they took in the 3rd round out of Tennessee and has a lot of speed, but obviously, at least for this year, you got Mostert in a chain in front of him. I don't know about Mostert, longer term. He's the oldest starting running back in the league. What do you think about Jalen Wright? Do you think he has some fantasy appeal this year and beyond?
This year, I just think there is too much going on. I think Mostert, he's not doing 19 touchdowns again this year. Let's just call that what it is.
Yeah.
I think A-Chain doesn't have the body to hold up and be a 200, 250 touch guy. I also don't think he's averaging 7 yards a carry again like he did last year. I think if he's at 5.5 or 5.5 this year, you're still really happy with that. The Jalen Wright situation comes down to this. Raheem Mostert gets hurt. and Jalen Wright probably becomes the main guy in that backfield. And if that happens and he starts to flash and he uses that speed, we know Mike McDaniel loves his speedy running back. So there's a reason they took him. He fits the mold. The man loves him, a fast player. I mean, Tyreek and Jalen Waddle on the outside. So, yeah, I guess we could see it this year, but it's just interesting because this is a running back class that was not very highly touted. But like I said, there's two guys that I think have the body and makeup to be long-term guys, and that's Brooks and Benson. But Wright's probably my third guy out of there.
No, fair enough. I was just curious because you didn't mention him, so I wanted to pick your brain.
No, real quick, not a fan of Braylon Allen or no?
Braylon Allen has a big fat Breece Hall problem. And Breece Hall is my personal running back too this year. I have him ahead of Bijan. I just love the talent that guy has. He's big enough. He's fast. He catches the ball. He does everything. He's a 3-down guy. So Braylon Allen will have to do a lot and turn a lot of heads, and really he would have to do something otherworldly to take me off the Breece Hall ledge, because that is one of everybody has their guys heading into a season. Breece Hall is one of my guys heading into this season.
Planting your flag, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
All right, so, sticking here with the Panthers, Bryce Young had a season to forget in 2023, but Carolina has made all the right moves to help Young in his development. Young could easily be the best quarterback Canales has ever had, but is Young worth the dart throw in dynasty leagues, or should fantasy players wait another year to see if Young is the guy?
Oh, this is where this season, I'm going to either show myself to be an idiot or a visionary, because I have been all in on buying Bryce Young this offseason. Everywhere. Like offensive line upgrades, positional upgrades, skill guy upgrades, coach upgrade. Like, he's got a guy in Canales who has turned around Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield. Carolina probably pretty much made that hire only to try to save this Bryce Young draft pick. So, like, with as low and as cheap as Bryce Young is, he's still around like quarterback 28 or 29 in terms of ADP. Like, he's a former number 1 overall pick. Like, I have never seen, and you guys would agree with me on this, I'm sure, one player fall so far out of the good graces of the fantasy community and be a first-round draft pick within a year. I mean, we even had N'Keal Harry hope in year 2 after he bombed out year 1. Like, people were still like, still maybe N'Keal Harry, but that didn't work out, and people still had faith in him. People are acting like the obituary is written on Bryce Young for some people right now, and I'm just not there yet. So I'm buying right now because it's just it was an easy acquisition earlier in the offseason. It was even easier. It's probably still pretty easy right now, but I'm buying that. I'm making those easy trades. If I have to give up a future second-round pick to get Bryce Young in a dynasty format, I'm doing that. If I can take him in the 19th round of a fantasy draft and it's a super flex and he's my quarterback 3, I'm doing that. I'm buying the upside because it's so cheap.
So you answered a little bit the question I'm about to ask you, but it's a broader question because it's about the whole team. So, look, the Panthers won 2 games last year. They didn't have a first-round draft pick because of the Bryce Young trade, which obviously was the Caleb Williams pick that the Bears made. And they figure to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL again this year, along with maybe, Denver, New England, a couple other teams. Are you buying the discount on the Panthers players in redraft? We're not talking about dynasty here, but in redraft, or are they generally a team that you're staying away from in fantasy redraft?
No, I'm buying the dip because there's value in the dip. Like, Deontay Johnson is going to go later than he probably should because he plays for the Panthers. And he's a 150 target guy. Chuba Hubbard is coming off a 275 touch season, and he's going pretty late. So I'm probably buying into that. Bryce Young averaged 5.5 yards per attempt, and people wrote him off because he had a terrible offensive line. I'm buying that dip. So yeah, I'm into that idea because all of them can be happening relatively cheap compared to where you can get somebody with a similar sort of skill set. I'll give you an example real quick. Somebody who probably has some upside in an offense, but because he's on a much better team, is going much higher according to ADP. I mean, Rico Dotto is around running back 45 right now compared to Chuba Hubbard, who is lower than that. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle are kind of in that same bus right now. Actually, Chuba's 41, Rico Dowdle is 45, Jaleel McLaughlin is 46. Jerome Ford, this is a great one. Running back 36. So we're not even sure he's going to have a full season of work, yet he's going 5 spots higher. A guy like Zach Moss and Chase Brown, 33 and 34. Devin Singletary, running back 31. All of these are guys who are probably going to not have as many touches as Chuba Hubbard. Yet Chuba Hubbard is going around running back 41, where some of these guys are 5, 10, 15 spots ahead of him in ADP. So, yeah, take that dip, take that chance. Don't rely on them to be a big producer in your team. But if you draft them and you start to see some reduction there and you can get them late, then, yeah, I'm into that for sure.
Yeah, excellent points on that. Sometimes those discount players, man, can be what you need to get over the hump.
Yeah, that's one thing that I kind of tend to gravitate towards when I'm doing research. Because let's face it, in fantasy football, it doesn't matter what, like, whatever position. Everybody knows our top 5 in wide receivers: CD, Tyreek, Chase, Amon-Ra, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown. Like, these dudes are all slam dunks no matter what. Like,
yeah,
if I tell you draft A.J. Brown, I'm not giving you an advantage because you know that. Like,
right.
So I'd much rather spend my time doing that research on guys who might be a little bit under the radar, between the cracks, different things like that. So, yeah, I'm into the late round research stuff for sure.
Absolutely. All right, excuse me, Rhett. Here's the part you've all been waiting for, or you've been waiting for, rather. The New Orleans Saints.
Jesus
Head
Christ.
coach Dennis Allen. Yeah, Jesus Christ is, probably has some players saying that in the locker room about Dennis Allen, who looks to be an old school coach, and he doesn't shy away from calling out players publicly. As a Saints fan, what are your thoughts on that? And has Allen earned the right to do that, do you think?
Oh, God. Have you read my tweets or something? Because you just asked me what I think about Dennis Allen. And this is a multi-layered answer for me because I can't answer the Dennis Allen question without answering the Mickey Loomis question. And I'm going to say this. When Mickey Loomis got up in his postseason press conference, smacking his little gum and comparing Dennis Allen to Bill Belichick and Bill Walsh and other absolutely legendary coaches, is damn near when I gave up on this franchise altogether. There is a lot to dislike about Dennis Allen. There's a lot to dislike about Mickey Loomis. I'll go as far as to say this. I was in the firm belief that Mickey Loomis is so into the idea of doing things his way that he took the easy way out in firing Pete Carmichael instead of just cleaning the house altogether and getting rid of Dennis Allen. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think he's earned the right to call out players. I think the fact that you saw Jameis Winston do what he did at the end of last season and call a play against Dennis Allen's will to get Jamal Williams a touchdown tells you everything you need to know about the respect that he has inside of that locker room. So he can be as old school as he needs to be. If his players are not responding to him, then this is we're going to talk wins and losses here. This is a 7-win team at best, and that's me being generous if Dennis Allen is running the show this season. And that could be with a really good offense. Clint Kubiak can come in and do a tremendous job. I think Atlanta's too good. I think Tampa is too good. I think they they can beat Carolina twice. But altogether, yeah, I'm not the most optimistic New Orleans Saints fan to talk about this with right now because I'm just very out on the idea of the direction of this franchise.
And I assume Allen's a hot seat coach this year. I mean, he's got to be, right?
He better be. My God.
As I think of coaches around the league, he's probably among the hottest hot seats because there's a lot of coaches that are first-year coaches, second-year coaches, or coaches that just got new contracts. So
I think Mickey Loomis needs to hope and pray that this offense comes out shooting lasers this season, and this team is still bad because it gives him an easy way to fire Dennis Allen and promote Clint Kubiak to head coach. I think that's the best case scenario for this franchise is that this offense, Clint Kubiak delivers on the Kyle Shanahan system. This offense looks better. But the defense is still people give this defense a lot of credit for what it is. And it was good in spots last year. It was also very, very bad in spots last year. And they're starting some dudes that are a little bit past their best days. I mean, Cam Jordan is still going to have a very prominent role in this defense. Tyrann Mathieu is not quite the player he used to be. Marshawn Lattimore, for as good as he is, I think is a little bit overrated as a cornerback myself. So, yeah, there's some things to like about this team, especially on the defensive end. But, yeah, Dennis Allen and his leadership abilities, not one of them at all.
One thing you can always count on with Marshawn Lattimore is at least one fight with Mike Evans during the season. So it's unbelievable. Those two just go at each other, and it's one of the best.
What a rivalry. Yeah, I love that.
It really is one of the best in the NFL. Of like, if you think of best rivalry of an offensive and defensive player in the NFL, I kind of can't think of another one that's like that.
I mean, who else can you run across in your life twice a year? Like, just think of anybody you're going to run across in your life twice a year.
That you hate that much.
Yeah, that you want to punch in the face anytime you see them. Like, that's an unbelievable amount of hate in each of their cities. It's crazy.
Well, it's like the Ravens and Steelers, the entire teams. So, but yeah, I think Lattimore and Evans is the best man-on-man rivalry. So I'm glad we got to talk about that because we are talking about the NFC South. One player that's kind of it's like the fantasy guy who defies logic and is eligible maybe at two positions is Taysom Hill, the Swiss Army knife, kind of a unique talent. And when he's been given the chance, he produces. It's hard to predict, and it's almost like the term spike week in fantasy was invented for him because he'll give you 3 straight weeks of 0 fantasy points, 2 fantasy points, 1 fantasy point, and then 30. And you never know when he's gonna kind of erupt. But a lot of Saints have been banged up in the preseason this year, including the presumptive starting tight end Juwan Johnson, who I think has a pec injury or something like that. And then a whole bunch of other guys, Kendre Miller, Kamara, Rashid Shaheed. A lot of guys have had smaller injuries that have cropped up. Is Taysom Hill someone you're targeting in the later rounds of fantasy drafts? And full disclosure, he made my sleepers column this year.
So I'm okay.
Not necessarily as a guy you want to start every week, but I like having him on my roster.
Yeah, I'm one of the few Saints fans who is not gung-ho, wearing my number 7 on a weekly basis, waving my Taysom Hill flag sort of guy. I understand the value he brings to the team because, heck of an athlete. Sneezes into 5 yards a carry and really does a lot of little things well. That being said, we are talking fantasy football, and his snap share last season, and let's just go with what we have. Let's go with the data that we have. Was a 29.2% snap share last season. That is encouraging if he was a year 1 guy who was stumbling into a role. Whenever you're a 33-year-old, do it all, jack of all trades, master of none sort of player, like Taysom Hill sort of is, that concerns me. So like late round, Sure. Like multiple eligibility, sure. Like a few years back, whenever he was getting starts at quarterback and he had tight end eligibility, you could sneak that into the tight end position and get those quarterback points. Like there are times where it's useful. And at the end of your bench, absolutely. But it's one of those things where, like you said, I can't really predict when that's going to come. So I don't know if it's just my bias talking, my bitterness with this franchise talking, but for some reason I'm less inclined to take the Taysom Hill chance because despite the fact that he always seems to be used and lines up out wide in the passing game, he doesn't really catch many passes. Right. Despite the fact that he's a 5 yards per carry runner, he never seems to get that many carries. So it's like it's one of these things where like he's such a talented player. I'm just not sure outside of those 3 or 4 weeks a year where he's going to give you that boom week. It's just such a difficult thing to predict. He's like, I see the appeal, and at the same time, I can't bring myself to do it, if that makes any sense at all.
Limit him to best ball.
Yeah, great in best ball. Taysom Hill, fantastic in best ball. Perfect.
Yeah, so, somebody who's good in all formats, Alvin Kamara, was a favorite target for fantasy players the last couple of months. But he suffered a recent back injury. It doesn't sound too serious. Yet his efficiency has regressed 3 years in a row, and he's now 29. With no real threats behind Kamara to take work away, are you buying the discount on Kamara?
This is the flow chart on my Alvin Kamara take. Will Alvin Kamara catch 80 passes? If yes, draft. If no, proceed with more caution. Because if you watched any Alvin Kamara last year, that explosiveness, that ability to wiggle and make explosive plays just wasn't there. Like we talked about this last Wednesday on our NFC South preview. Alvin Kamara had a 13 catch, 31-yard game last year, which was the most hilarious and appalling stat line all at the same time. Like 13 catches on 14 targets at 31 yards, sub 4 yards a carry. But if you're in a PPR format and he's catching 70 to 85 passes, he's the second pass catching option in that offense. I mean, it's hard to avoid that. It's hard to look at that and say, I'm not interested. Like, you have to be interested in it because of the PPR upside.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I remember that week that he did that, and it was unbelievable. He was getting like 13 3-yard catches. They were like less than runs. It was unbelievable. So let's talk about the quarterback for a second. So Derek Carr had a kind of a rough first year in New Orleans. He ended the season a little stronger. He had 3 QB1 performances down the stretch. With the changes that the Saints made to their coaching staff and additions to the offense, is Carr someone you can see, kind of bouncing back, having a top 20 season? And are you okay with him as your QB2 in a super flex?
Yeah, he's absolutely okay as my quarterback 2 in a super flex. I mean, just looking at raw numbers last year, he was 10th in pass attempts. He averaged 32 a game. For someone who is criticized for not pushing the ball down the field, he was number 6 in the league in deep ball attempts last year. He was top 10 in red zone attempts. The Saints were 10th in pass attempts per game, 11th in pace of play. He was 13th in passing yards. He was 9th in air yards. There was a lot of efficiency metrics where Derek Carr was really, really good, actually. So if you're going strictly off of efficiency metrics, and I am an efficiency guy, it's hard to avoid a guy that's going that late and can potentially return that type of value for you. So yeah, as a quarterback 2 in a super flex, absolutely in on the idea of getting Derek Carr.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this says anything about how the Saints feel about Derek Carr now, but I know he was a day 3 pick. But could you see if maybe Carr struggles and this offense struggles? Do you think we could see Spencer Rattler at all this season?
Could, yes. Like if things get really bad, like Dennis Allen is fired, mid-season, and they finally make the decision that the Saints never seem to do is like, all right, we're finally clearing the decks. Like Kamara's getting traded, Lattimore's getting traded. Like if they finally decide to press the reset button, the hard reset button, and they want to see what they have in Spencer Rattler, I could absolutely see that happening in the worst case scenario. In an everyday Derek Carr is struggling a little bit scenario, no, I think they're sticking with Carr for the season.
Yeah, probably the
Fair enough. All right, we got some questions now that kind of we've covered the 4 teams, and I think we've hit on most of the main fantasy assets across the 4 teams. So now we'll ask some or talk about some more broader questions across the entire division. Rhett, which player from this division do you want on all your fantasy teams, regardless of format?
Godwin. He's back in the slot this season. His best seasons have been in the slot. 2 years ago, he had a 72% slot rate or something like that. He had 98 catches. 3 years ago was a 70.2% slot rate. He had 104 catches. Like Chris Godwin in the slot he just delivers. He's just money. So give me all the Chris Godwin in the slot this year because he's going late enough to where he's still a value.
I like that.
Well, you stole my answer. Stole my answer, and Godwin's another guy that that was in my column today. Players I'm targeting because I agree with you. I think he's never been this cheap since he had the big season in 2019. And I had read too about how much more they plan to use him in the slot. Actually wrote down Chris Godwin and Deontay Johnson for this one. Obviously, I'd like as much Bijan as I can get, but when it's a player with that price tag in drafts, you have to draw a certain number to be able to even get him, or in an auction league, have to be willing to pay a lot to get him. So he's not a guy you can get on a lot of teams. But Godwin and Deontay Johnson are. So those are the 2 guys from this division at their ADP that I'd like to get as much of as I can. How about you, Paul? Who are you targeting in this division?
You were just talking about him, Dave. I'm going Bijan, and that's not an easy thing to do, right? Like you said, you have to kind of have that winning lottery ticket to get him. But at that price tag, he's got league winning capability. So he's somebody, if you can, you get him on all your teams. Which player? Who's your favorite sleeper in this division, Rhett?
It's Bryce, and for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. I mean, it can't get worse. He's not getting drafted in redraft, so he's see what happens in the draft and pick him up after week 1 in the wire. Like if he comes out in the first week and he throws for 260 and a couple scores and no interceptions, like all of a sudden, like he's free. He's free money. You spend $15 a fab, $20 a fab if you have $100 budget, and you go and you get that guy. Like it just makes too much sense to deny it in a redraft format, especially since there is a 99.9% chance that he's going undrafted in a 1 quarterback and maybe even a 2 quarterback format.
How about you, Dave?
Yeah, mine is Darnell Mooney, a guy we haven't mentioned yet on this show. And, it kind of didn't get a lot of publicity, but Rondale Moore is out for the season. And I sort of thought Mooney and Moore, with the 2 of them there, might kind of cannibalize each other. And we haven't really heard much from Rondale Moore in the last couple of years. But if you look at Kirk Cousins' history, he's done a good job of having, being able to support more than one wide receiver. And it's not all going to go to Drake London and Kyle Pitts. I mean, I do think it'll be a fairly concentrated target tree, but I could see Darnell Mooney, who's basically free in drafts. I took him in the Scott Fish Bowl in, I think, round 21 or 20. And that was when Rondale Moore was still healthy. But so maybe Mooney's gone up in price a little bit. But I think he's just a guy that, he's a dart throw. But I think he could surprise this year. No one's talking about him. But, he's the number 2 receiver in Atlanta, as far as I know. And I think there's some value to that.
And he's got a 1,000-yard season on his resume as well. I mean, it helps.
Good. He was good a couple years ago, and Chicago has had such bad quarterback play and inconsistent quarterback play the last couple years. And Mooney's a deep threat, and they didn't really have anyone who could take advantage of that. But Kirk Cousins should be able to. So that's mine. Paul, who's your sleeper in this division?
I'm going to go with Jamal Williams. We talked a little bit about Alvin Kamara and how his efficiency has regressed. We saw him lead the league in touchdowns just only 2 years ago in Detroit. I'm not saying he'll do that this year, but I could see him having 5 or more touchdowns, kind of being somebody that could be a bye-week fill-in, or even if something were to happen to Kamara, be a weekly flex play.
Fair enough. Let's move on to everyone's least favorite word, which is bust. And I won't try to define it. But Rhett, we'll start with you. Which player in this division are you worried might be a bust this season?
Rachaad White. I mean, I loved him last season. Like very early in this offseason, I had him very high. Then Bucky Irving happened, and they seem to want to move away from his inefficiency a little bit. And it seems like everything that makes Rachaad White a good fantasy asset, they kind of seem to be taking away from him bit by bit, piece by piece. So if that happens, Rachaad White was valuable last year because he was a 300 touch running back in a Dave Canales offense where they like to use one running back. Well, if they're using 2 running backs this year, then you can take that Rachaad White value that you had with as high as he's going and just kind of take some of that away from him. So I'm concerned about the Rachaad White thing this season with where he's going. I don't think it's going to pay off.
Fair enough. I'll give mine, and then Paul, you can go. And I don't think this player is going to be a bust, but I do think he's going to underperform his ADP for the second year in a row, and that's Chris Olave. And I like the talent, think he's a very good player, but I don't understand his ADP. He's played 2 years in the NFL, and I know they've had 2 different quarterbacks in those 2 seasons, but he's got 9 touchdowns in those 2 seasons. And you look at his ADP, and it's kind of like sort of near the 2-3 turn, maybe a little later than that. And there's players like Deebo Samuel, Travis Kelce, Isaiah Pacheco, Drake London, Sam Laporta, Josh Jacobs. I'd rather have every one of those players this season than Chris Olave. I just trust all of them more. And I think Olave at this point, until he kind of proves it with a really big season, I think he's a little overrated. And I think, people kind of see his name and he flashed at times as a rookie and kind of people think it's kind of like him and Garrett Wilson, but I haven't seen it yet enough from Olave to justify his ADP. So I don't think he'll be a bust. I think he'll be perfectly fine. And if I could get him in the 4th round or late 3rd, I'd feel a lot better about it than where he's being drafted. Paul, how about you? Who's your bust for this division?
We talked about this guy a little earlier, but I think Jonathan Brooks will be a bust, an ADP bust, maybe not a performance bust, just because I'm not sure how much playing time he'll get, and depending on how Carolina's team is performing, they might just let him, sit for the entire season if they're not playing well, and he's just having a slower timetable than they predicted him of recovery. So I'm going to go with Jonathan Brooks. Who's your favorite rookie to draft in this division, Rhett?
I think it's McMillan. I think he's surging right now of draft boards. I'm looking at player profiler right now on Underdog. Jalen McMillan is up a round and a half, 17.9 draft slots. So people are starting to catch on to what he can be. And if we're being perfectly honest, we know that it's going to be Evans and Godwin as your first 2 options. We know that 3rd option, in all likelihood, because it's very rare that it happens, that the 3rd option, that offense is going to have 100 targets. Like, it's just a high unlikelihood that you have 3 guys with 100 or more targets in a season. But if McMillan gets 80 targets, and that puts him in a spot to catch 55 to 60 balls, and he has some deep play capability and does all these different things, I mean, that pick 172 probably equates to about 15, 16 round ADP. Like, if you get a guy in the 15th or 16th round, they're catching 60 balls and they have 750, 800 yards and 4 or 5 touchdowns. I mean, you're getting value there. So I'm good with that.
Like that pick a lot. I went with Bucky Irvin just because, Tampa Bay has been on record saying that they kind of want to, or hinting rather, that they would like to limit Rachaad White's touches, and Bucky Irvin's look good. He's kind of a perfect complement to Rachaad White. And we saw Rachaad White, a lot of his production came from the passing work last season. I could see Bucky Irvin cutting into that. So I'm going to go with Bucky Irvin. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, Bucky Irving was my answer too, for kind of all the reasons that that we've talked about with Rachaad White. So he's my answer also. If I have to change it, I'll go Michael Penix Jr. I'm just kidding. He's not my favorite rookie. I don't think he's going to get drafted in most redraft leagues. No, so Irving is my answer too.
All right, here we are with your Fantasy Edge, and here you'll just share an account, a site, podcast, or maybe another resource you like and use that you feel gives you an edge in fantasy.
I think the one that I use the most, because it's free and you can get up really great analytics data for anybody pretty much at any point, is like Player Profiler is so good at what they do on their website. Like the Jalen McMillan stuff, like you can get college stuff, you can get the speed score, and then you can get game logs and matchups, who they matched up with last year against wide receivers, snap shares, like all these different things that just can kind of give people an edge. Like we, as complete degenerates of fantasy football, dive into all this stuff on a weekly basis anyway. Like for most casual players, which 95% of fantasy players happen to be casual players playing in a league with their buddies. I mean, this is the type of website that can really just give you an unreal advantage in just understanding how guys are being used and how quarterbacks are throwing the ball and things like that. So, I mean, I've always been a fan of what Madden those guys do at their website.
Like that. All right, here's a fantasy shout out. Share an account you think would be a good guest for the show.
Can I give you two of them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I want to go. I want to go one in the family and one outside of the family.
Okay.
First off, at Fantasy and Frames, the Dynasty Deviant Chris Burns. If you ever have the opportunity to talk to Burns, he is the most generous, kind-hearted, sweetheart of a person, and on top of that, just really just knows his stuff. Like Miami Dolphins guy as well, so y'all are gonna have that common connection. Just really good at what he does. Like so much respect for him. And then on the other side, just someone who's done a lot for me over the past year, Andrew Cooper at Fantasy Alarm. I mean, he's him and Howard, they're the tight end guys. They've taught me a lot on how to look at that position, but also just the fact that Andrew has done little things like he's told me anytime you need something, just don't be afraid to reach out. Like I'm just a fan of advertising people who I know have not their best interest at heart, but your best interest at heart. And those are two guys that 100% of the way are those type of people.
Love hearing that, man. All right, here's Dave's favorite question of the show. Give us a bold call, NFC South edition, my friend.
Oh, I love this one. A.T. Perry overtakes Rashid Shaheed as New Orleans' wide receiver 2 by midseason.
Oh.
A.T. Perry, 6'5", 210 pounds, 4 touchdown catches last season. Came on late in the year.
Yeah.
That San Francisco system needs receivers who are willing to block downfield. And A.T. Perry is one of those guys who's willing to do the dirty work and offers a very similar upside in the passing game as well to something like Shaheed would do. So, yeah, A.T. Perry, wide receiver 2 in that offense by midseason. I feel decent about that. I feel decent.
I like that. Dave, how about you?
All right, my bold call is that at least 2 of the 4 starting quarterbacks in this division will not be their team's starter opening day 2025.
Okay.
So Bryce, Baker, Kirk, and Carr. Two of them will not be starting for their current team in a year.
I like that. I'm going to go with Baker Mayfield has another top 10 fantasy season.
Ooh.
All right.
That's saucy. I like it.
So you'll be drafting some Mayfield then.
I have him on too many dynasty teams, so I'm trying to speak it into existence, Dave.
Yeah. Well, sometimes that works, you know. It's funny because, like, you know, I drafted my Scott Fishbowl team, and I found myself putting a bunch of the guys who I drafted in my, you know, like sleepers column and in my players I'm targeting column. I liked them when I drafted them then, so it's a little bit like I'm not just trying to wish it into existence, but you tend to build those biases, you know, guys on your roster. It's unavoidable.
Yes, sir. Well, Rhett, man, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time and coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. Before we get you out of here, tell us where about any content that you're creating and where we can find it.
All right. Every Wednesday night, 9 Eastern time, Fantasy and Frames YouTube channel. Fourth and Frames with my boy Drew Scott, Drew 3MR that y'all had on, and Nate Markham. We're doing the flagship thing. We're also going through divisional previews right now. We're firing up a listener league if anybody wants to get in on that with us. Just trying to do the best we can on a weekly basis, just to try to treat each other the right way, have a good time, and try to give people good, actionable content. And also, when I'm finding time, I'm writing for Fantasy and Frames and for Last Word on Sports. Recently had an understanding analytics series that I did that I really enjoyed, kind of just giving people that casual look on some very good stable metrics that can kind of help you, give you some predictability, and giving them one person that might be undervalued that you should draft based off of those stable metrics. And for me, one that stood out to me was in the running back one. Brian Robinson and his yards per route run kind of helped illuminate the fact for me that Austin Eckler might just be there more as insurance than he is to take work away from Brian Robinson, because he was a top 10 guy in routes run last year. He had a close to 2 yards per route run, and he actually led all running backs in the league in yards per reception last year. So just little things like that. Really like diving into those analytics things every once in a while and trying to help people understand them, so that way they can also take them out and use them, because otherwise they're just numbers on a page, and that's a lot of work for a lot of people. So just trying to explain those out in that series and help people out.
Numbers on a page sounds like a good podcast show.
Oh, nice. We'll run that by Jorge, see what he thinks.
Yes, sir. Rhett, again, thank you so much for your time. Remind the people they can find you on X.
Yeah, I can be found at R Sports on X. And like I said, Wednesday night, Fourth and Frames, 9 Eastern. That's where we are every week, having a good time.
Yes, sir. Dave, where can we find you?
Yep, you can find me on X at PigskinPapers. I post all my content there, but it's also running on Big Blue View, www.bigblueview.com, which is the Giants page on SB Nation. And you can find all my articles there. Paul, where can everyone find you on X, and where can they get at your Cowboys content?
Yes, you can find we can find my Cowboys content every Monday on X and on YouTube, and you can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15. As always, we appreciate you joining us, and we will see you guys next week.